Today I'm offering the final of three reflections on an appeal that was made at the 7th Congress of Leaders of World and Traditional Religions, met in Kazakhstan earlier this year. Roger kicked us off on these reflections by taking us through the realities of our tumbling world, and I followed last week by reflecting on the role or maybe the possibility of hope in such a world that was so upside down. Those are familiar topics for us, but the appeal then takes a turn to a topic that, at least for me, is both more complicated and more personally challenging: the role of religion and religious communities, spiritual communities in all of these things. And the appeal holds in tension both the conviction that religions are often part of the problem, not the solution, and the hope that religions have something to offer to help us navigate through and transform the challenges that surround us. As I've shared many times, religion and spirituality have been sources both of great pain and trauma in my life and of great joy and wisdom. Looking back, I really don't know if I even would have survived my teen years without the spiritual practices I began at that time. And those practices, some of them to this day, remain with me, nourishing and sustaining me through my entire life. On the other hand, harmful religious teachings and practices also inflicted or set me up for abuse in the first place and gave me something I needed to heal from. If I identified with either of those experiences, I could easily conclude that religion was an overwhelmingly good force in our world. Or I could conclude it was an overwhelmingly bad force in our world. The truth is almost always complicated in that way. In many ways, religions are a long-running, uncontrolled social experiment on the human condition and social change. And we've proved time and again that we can use religious beliefs, practices, and institutions either to help or to harm. This reality is also reflected in our collective perceptions, too. I found a 2017 survey by Ipsos that asked more than 17,000 people from 23 countries a simple question: does religion do more harm than good in the world? 49% said, you bet, it does. But both framing the question this way and the division we have over its answer invites us to look more deeply at what's going on. If all cultural, including all religious systems, have been used to justify everything from the terrifying to the sublime, who is it that gets to define what is a problem and what is a solution? Who gets to decide what is good, both individually and collectively? Dorothee Solle called this the double function of religion: as apology and legitimation of the status quo and its culture of injustice on one hand, and as a means of protest, change, and liberation on the other hand. James Cone expressed the same kind of idea as a choice between two alternatives: one, to accept the oppressor's value system and thus be contented with the place the oppressor set for them, or two, to find a completely new way of looking at reality that enables them to fight against oppression. That sounds easy enough, doesn't it? It feels like it should be easy. Yet we still manage to become divided over what is oppression, what is liberation, what is right, what is wrong. I've watched with a mixture of amazement and horror as my own friends and relatives and I have taken very different roads over the last 20 years. I would never have predicted people I used to respect defending cruelty, violence, bigotry. One conversation in particular, when it was first being revealed what was happening on the southwest border and the concentration camps that were being set up, children being held in cages. And I couldn't believe that they would take those actions and say, we had to do it. It's not a big deal. It's not a bad thing. We're taking better care of them than they could have taken care of themselves. I couldn't fathom it. I never could have predicted that. And I've watched others as they've gradually accommodated injustice, a kind of creeping oppression that is accepted as this is just the way things are. And I have felt my own energy lag. Not that I think any of these things are okay, but how do I get up the energy and will to do anything about it sometimes? It can be easy to describe legitimation of injustice and liberation towards change in their ideal forms, but most of us live in a more messy, in-between place. Discerning which is which and when, and acting accordingly is essential if we want our present troubles to be birth pangs of a new world rather than the death throes of humanity. I've been thinking about these things in my own life recently from a different kind of view. Last year in July, a good friend wrote to me after many years, I'm kind of embarrassed to say how many actually, that we'd been out of touch. And as we caught up with each other and swapped stories, we started noticing several similarities. When we last knew each other, it was the mid-1990s, and we were both very earnest in our faith, and I, at least, was very naive. We both took the vision of a just and peaceful world that was proclaimed by Jesus and the prophets as possible and joyful, something within our reach, something really practical to attain. Neither of us were planning on doing anything in our lives like preaching. Instead, both of us were initially involved with music and then got into community programming. Our paths weave through similar social issues, from food insecurity to Missouri's methamphetamine crisis. And both of us experienced criticism and even some harsh rejection for creating or joining those programs well before we had ever taught something controversial from a pulpit. A few stories have been vivid in my own mind as I sort through all these memories. I was a pastor of a small rural church, and even on the small scale, liberation was experienced as a threat to those who had a settled way of doing things, a way that had conveniently excluded all the people that society had pushed to the margins. As you might guess, money often had a lot to do with those experiences. On more than one occasion, and I think I've mentioned this before, but it's so clear in my memory, the church treasurer would confront me while I was printing the bulletins, the weekly bulletins. And this was a pretty brilliant tactic, if I say so myself. The photocopier was in a very small room, and it had one door. There was nowhere to go. There was no way to escape her scathing words. She would stand in that doorway and just let me have it. Her criticisms often amounted to what became a refrain. The people you bring to church cost more money than they give. I was making the church's finances unsustainable by the work I was doing in the community. As I mentioned, I was very naive, and I thought I had a solution. I got the board to approve a restructuring of my salary. I would reduce what I got paid every week in order to create a community fund. They would take that difference of my pay and put it aside. And that way, when people came to us needing assistance or there was a special ministry opportunity, we would have a small budget to meet those needs. I knew enough that I shouldn't be in charge of that fund, so at least 2 deacons needed to approve of any request. But it was still not enough. I found myself facing a new criticism. The gossip now became that I wanted to reduce my salary so I wouldn't have to tithe as much to the church. That one never made any sense to me, but it didn't stop the rumor from going all the way around town. On one occasion, I was providing pastoral care for a terminally ill man. Years before, he had been an active member of the church, years before I had arrived there. But a messy conflict had driven him away. And we worked through a lot of those issues as he made peace with his imminent death. Before he died, he told me and his wife that he wanted to have his funeral and be buried at the church. It was a very moving, a sacred moment of healing and hope. So I'm pretty glad he didn't live to see the fallout. My misstep this time was that I didn't realize that because he had reconciled himself to the church, his family was then entitled to a ham dinner for the funeral. This was a significant but not huge expense. Nevertheless, some church members resented having to foot the bill. Instead of celebrating the sacred work of dying with peace, we argued over who was going to buy the hams. I can confess to some passive aggression here on my own part, as I ultimately agreed to pay for the hams, but I then reduced my offering to the church by that same amount the next week. I was so angry that this kind of petty, selfish bickering could spoil something so holy. These kinds of memories have helped me rethink how liberation and legitimation work in the real world. It's often through these small, seemingly unimportant habits. Any one of those habits of thinking and acting and speaking might seem inconsequential, something we can just overlook. It's just the way things are. We don't notice that taken together, the cumulative effect is to create a powerful culture, a powerful system. This is how oppression often establishes and sustains itself, not just through gross and obvious injustices, but through these little small habits of accommodating harmful behavior, leaving conflict unresolved, avoiding uncomfortable situations and conversations, and being reluctant to take meaningful action. If we move to the large scale, we can call to mind the experience of Angelina and Sarah Grimke. They were sisters who were raised in a wealthy slaveholding household in South Carolina in the early 1800s, who became prominent abolitionists. It should not surprise you to know that their journey also included a religious transformation, converting from Episcopalianism to Presbyterianism and finally to Quakerism. That journey was quite literally one of moving from legitimation of oppression, where people were using religion to excuse and defend vile racism and the abhorrent practice of slavery, to liberation, using religion to undermine that evil institution and promote freedom. It would be easy to let the reference just end there, because Quakers have been very firmly established in the popular mind as being on the right side of history. And that is well earned in so many respects. But humans are not that simple, not even Quakers. And the history of the Religious Society of Friends is a wonderful opportunity to see this struggle between legitimation and liberation in action. In the case of opposing slavery, Quakers did adopt a broadly abolitionist stance much earlier than most civil or religious groups in either Europe or the colonies. But by the time that Quakers in Pennsylvania formally condemned participation in the slave trade in 1758, they had been at work on this issue for nearly a century. Nearly a century of activism and labor preceded that declaration. The conversation began at least in the 1670s in Barbados, where Quaker colonists first raised the question of, maybe we shouldn't be involved in this. And then in 1688, 3 Quakers and a Lutheran in Pennsylvania, Germantown, openly opposed slavery. And it's the first time we know of going on the record like that. The movement would ripen in the 1700s through the work of people whose names are more familiar, such as Benjamin Lay, John Woolman, and Anthony Benezet. Even early adoption, this is the best case scenario we're talking about, right? Even early adoption was slow work, and many of those who began that work didn't live long enough to see the fruit. And even then, with this great success, that success of condemning slavery as a practice did not mean that all Quakers were suddenly in the right about everything. The liberation commitments continued to exist alongside legitimation commitments, and conflict bubbled up and sometimes overflowed. Again, it's vital, I think, that we know these fuller stories, and this is why historical accounts like Fit for Freedom but Not for Friendship, Quakers, African Americans, and the Myth of Racial Justice by Donna McDaniel and Vanessa July are so important. This more complete history is, as Kathy Wald described it, a roller coaster ride from the heights of admiration for my religious community to the depths of embarrassing chagrin. Far from being discouraging, these more realistic accounts of human limitations and human transformation can be vital to encouraging one another to this day. When we understand that our spiritual ancestors had an equally messy set of conditions, as challenging and complicated as much of what we face, and yet they persevered in doing what was right, that can affirm our own perseverance. And there's much to learn about the practical side of working for change and learning what sustains us as individuals, communities, and movements. In the case of the Grimke sisters, their convictions eventually made them outcasts even in their Orthodox Quaker community in Philadelphia, to the point that they eventually had to leave that meeting. Despite the Quakers and that city's reputation for abolitionist sentiments, Sarah and Angelina's views were considered to go too far, too fast. Mark Perry, author of Lift Up Thy Voice, described their situation. He wrote, "After Angelina's letter to William Lloyd Garrison appeared in The Liberator, the sisters met with a chilly reception at the 4th and Arch Street Friends meeting. They were also unwelcome now in Catherine Morris's home, especially since Angelina had questioned her about the society's policy of making its black congregants sit on separate benches during Quaker services. Catherine was shocked and dismayed by Angelina's query. She said that she agreed with the seating practice and that there were firm reasons for the existence of the quote-unquote colored bench, and that such questions should not even be asked. She believed in the efficacy of silent witness, the practice of leaving change to conscience and good work. Sarah and Angelina accepted Catherine's reasoning, but they found the 4th and Arch Street meeting services increasingly stifling. They resented the disdainful looks and verbal reproaches they received during their own public shows of devotion. Angelina was angry. Sarah felt rejected. Both felt they were being treated as outsiders." Perry goes on to say that the sisters understandably felt embittered by and alienated from their own meaning. When I read that, I thought, oh, this is an experience that I could relate to. Embittered by and alienated from the people that they thought they belonged to, they thought they had community with. I'm so glad that the story doesn't end there, because Angelina and Sarah did not settle for that feeling. Instead, they held firm in their convictions, eventually embraced their status as lapsed Quakers, and transformed their rejection into a deeper commitment and courage to act. In Perry's words, Sarah's and Angelina's years of struggle with their religion and their conversions from Episcopalians to Presbyterians to Orthodox Quakers and finally to lapsed Quakers served them well. No longer fearful of such changes, they now welcomed them. Nor were they intimidated as they once had been by the judgments of others. They were now willing to disagree openly with those whom they most admired. I think this is a good example of James Cone's insight that we are constantly navigating choices between accepting the oppressor's value system and finding a completely new way of looking at reality that enables us to fight against oppression. So how do we work with all our human limitations and access our human possibilities for a social change in the direction of social justice? In 2017, I tried to make the case for 4 approaches that religious and spiritual communities could use to support us in being part of the solution instead of part of the problem, as our appeal to the World Congress of Religions asked us to reflect on. Those 4 things were simply this. First, we can provide opportunities to expose, understand, and subvert oppressive systems and cultures, to learn how to think, including to think about our own roles in those oppressive systems as those who suffer injustice and those who inflict or benefit from injustice. This is the prophetic role, supported by critical theory, critical thinking. Second, we can teach and model tools that integrate such critical reflection with mindful action in a cycle of emergent strategy. This is the contemplative role, supported by reflective practice. Third, we can transform how we relate to one another so that we nurture wholeness instead of oppression in our relationships with each other and the earth. And this is that role of the gathered community of coming together, learning how to be in healthy relationships with one another, supported by community development and transformative justice practices. And fourth, we can connect folks with resources, organizations, and actions from around the world that empower us to act in meaningful and effective ways. This is the role of movement building, supported by community organizing and network. I find all four of those approaches still compelling and relevant. Your list may be different, but that's okay. That's also part of the work of building communities and movements for change. Because the heart of the question of whether religion and spirituality can be of any help in our present times comes down to these decisions that we make. Becoming aware of and resisting all the ways we are complicit in legitimizing injustice, that's spiritual growth. That's spiritual practice. Actively participating in movements that liberate us toward peace and justice is also spiritual growth and spiritual practice. Rather than dividing us up between the good and the bad, categorizing ourselves as, I support liberation and you support legitimation, we can align ourselves around transformation of oppression, become aware of how we are making these choices all the time. As I shared some years ago in a reflection on the sociology of prayer, this world is both beautiful and terrible. Humanity is both beautiful and terrible. The line between the two can sometimes be very fine, between the sublime and the brutal, and the burden is sometimes overwhelming. Joy that cannot be contained, sorrow that cannot be contained. There's only room in my small heart if I make the room. So I make it my practice to make room right here, to take the bounds of my small life and make it boundless, my heart and mind wide open, both to the suffering and to the exuberant joy of living. I read and sing and walk and plant wildflowers. Paying attention, I can learn how to love. We don't have to resign ourselves to the injustice of oppression. We don't have to resign humanity to the vacuous pursuit of accumulating money, power, and pleasure. We don't have to lose ourselves in the resistance to this injustice. But we can find ways to preserve our own humanity in the face of all these things and find ways to care for the earth, for each other, and for our shared future. And that is the best prayer or hope that I can think of or know. Thanks.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.